even though you made no corrections for excursions from the localizer or glide slope. What this tells you is that to keep the needles perfectly centered, all you needed were a few smooth corrections on the way in. I remember riding an Air Canada 727 into New York LaGuardia one day. The pilot was totally smooth. He set the power once for the approach and never changed it until the flare. The airplane flew to touchdown as if it were on rails. I don't ride the airlines much, but when I do, I notice that even most airline pilots are not as smooth as that Air Canada guy. The power is up and back on the approach, and they're pitching bank changes all the way in. Not with this pilot.
The smoothness of his flying made a lasting impression on me, and it's always a challenge to try to match that pilot's technique.
Partial panel instrument flight can be described as controlling the airplane by reference to a limited number of flight instruments. These instruments often consist of the airspeed and turn and slip indicators, as well as the clock and magnetic compass. Instrument failure could be caused by either vacuum, electrical, or pitot-static source failure. Vacuum failure often causes the attitude and heading indicators to become inoperative. If your airplane is equipped with digital instruments, an electrical failure may cause you to rely on the standby analog instruments: airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, and altimeter. Instrument failures in glass-equipped airplanes may also be partial failures due to the malfunction of a single component within the system. This failure could be a box sending information to a display or a display itself. For primary flight display failures, many glass-equipped airplanes are capable of displaying the full instrument panel on an alternate display. With this type of failure, you may have all of your instruments, but you will be scanning a different area of the panel. Partial failures in either analog or digital instruments could also be caused by a faulty pitot-static system, such as a blocked pitot tube or static source. The gyroscopes for analog attitude and heading indicators can be powered by a vacuum or pressure pump mounted on the engine accessory case or electrically. The gyroscope for an analog turn indicator is usually electrically powered, giving you wing level ability in case of a pump failure. The attitude indicator is usually the first instrument to slowly show a pump failure, usually by incorrect pitch indications. An additional problem is that it usually ends up showing a nose-low banked attitude. To get some notion of how vacuum-driven instruments react to a power failure, sit in the airplane for a few minutes after engine shutdown to observe the indications as the gyros spool down. This is disconcerting and distracting when you are actually flying, trying to control the airplane. Your task will be a lot easier if you cover up the inoperative instruments. The fact that electrical or pump failure makes the gyroscopic instruments vulnerable to failure stresses the need to include the other instruments in the scan. Any discrepancy between the gyro instruments and the other instruments must be viewed with suspicion. The best evidence of a pump failure is when the other instruments do not confirm what is shown by the heading or attitude indicators. Some general aviation airplanes also have a standby attitude indicator using a power source separate from the primary analog attitude indicator. An electric attitude indicator placed elsewhere in the panel makes an excellent backup to an air-powered unit. It can be useful for confirming a failure along with returning the airplane safely to the ground. If your airplane is so equipped, practice on the backup device is important. When a failure happens in instrument conditions, ask ATC for help. The most desirable response from ATC is clearance and vectors to VFR conditions. If this is not possible, ask ATC to avoid altitude changes, delays, and course changes. There was a time when many pilots flew a lot of partial panel because that's all they had. Back in those days, airspace was not as crowded or complex, and pilots were able to devote more of their attention to the basics of flying the airplane. As part of your emergency operations outlined in the practical test standards, you'll demonstrate to the examiner a non-precision approach with the loss of your primary flight instrument indicators, or to put it another way, you'll fly the approach on partial panel. In addition to the incentive of passing the practical portion of the instrument rating test, there is the real possibility that you may have to control the airplane after an actual failure. Let's take a look at flying an analog instrument airplane without the attitude and heading indicators. Without an attitude indicator, you have to rely on indirect instruments for attitude control. Using the altimeter to determine pitch requires interpretation of both the direction of needle movement and the rate at which the needle moves. A gain in altitude means the pitch attitude is above the flight level attitude. A rapid gain means that the deviation from level flight pitch attitude is large. A slow rate of altimeter needle movement indicates a small deviation from level flight. Avoid a large pitch change. Be content to slow down the rate of movement. If the altimeter needle slows abruptly, ease off some of the control pressure to keep the needle moving slowly. When the needle moves slowly, you are close to level flight. At that point, add some more control pressure to stop the direction of needle movement. If the needle stops moving, you are in level flight. If the needle reverses its movement, you have passed through level flight. Continue your scan and carefully relax control pressures. At constant power, the airspeed indicator will also give you an indirect indication of pitch. Again, you need to interpret both direction and rate of needle movement. Rapid movement means a large pitch deviation. Slow movement, a small deviation. As you respond with control pressure, the rate of airspeed needle movement slows and the airplane approaches level flight. When the airspeed needle stops, the airplane is approximately in the level flight attitude. The airspeed indicator is often accused of lagging. The indicator itself does not have any appreciable lag, but the airplane takes time to accelerate or decelerate in response to a pitch attitude change. The vertical speed indicator is both a trend and a rate instrument. Like the altimeter and airspeed indicator, it presents an indirect indication of pitch attitude. As a trend instrument, it quickly shows vertical movement of the airplane. With constant power, disregarding turbulence, this vertical movement is the result of a pitch change. As a rate instrument, an analog vertical speed indicator lags somewhat behind the actual rate of vertical movement. The amount of lag is directly proportional to both the speed and amount of pitch change. Abrupt, large pitch changes cause erratic needle movements and a greater lag before the needle stabilizes. Small, smooth pitch changes make the needle move with minimum lag and stabilize as aerodynamic forces become balanced in level, climbing, or descending flight. In level flight, the vertical speed indicator will quickly show deviations from level attitude. Use light control pressures to correct any up or down indications. With smooth and light control pressure, the needle will react quickly with little or no altitude change indicated on the altimeter. The airplane is in the approximate level attitude when the needle reverses. The needle will still be in the climb or descent part of the dial, but moving toward the zero position. To avoid over-controlling, the rate of return to the desired or assigned altitude should not be more than 500 feet per minute, or double the altitude correction. Remember, most airplanes are fairly stable in pitch. Be patient and don't hurry. Over-controlling has the net effect of too high a rate of return, which results in passing through the desired or assigned altitude. Without the attitude indicator for quick, direct reference for pitch attitude, trim becomes even more important. It's not desirable to maintain consistent elevator control pressure for any length of time. Now let's look at partial panel heading control in this situation. This is difficult for several reasons. First, because the airplane tends to be less stable in bank than in pitch. Second, the magnetic compass, which is usually the only heading instrument left, can only be relied on when the airplane is in straight, level, unaccelerated flight. From your private pilot certificate training, you'll recall that lag and lead and acceleration errors are caused by magnetic dip. During a level turn, the compass can only be believed on headings of east and west. And when accelerating or decelerating, the compass is only truthful on north and south headings. During turns, anytime the airplane is on a northerly heading, the compass will lag or be behind the airplane. On southerly headings, it will lead or run ahead of the airplane. On any headings other than north or south, acceleration will cause the compass to indicate north of the real heading, and during deceleration, indicate south of the real heading. Furthermore, the pedestal mounting of the compass card allows the case to tilt only 18 or so degrees before the card is locked up against the case. Lead, which is greatest on south headings, and lag, which is maximum on north headings, vary with the latitude where the turn is made. An average for the lower 48 states is about 30 degrees maximum, which decreases uniformly as the airplane approaches east and west headings. In a left turn, the airplane is pointing north when the compass indicates 030 degrees. In a right turn, it's pointing north when the compass indicates 330 degrees. Turning to north in a 15-degree bank left turn, the rollout should start when the compass indicates 037 or 038 degrees. In a right turn to south, the rollout should start when the compass indicates 202 or 203 degrees. The problem of lag and lead is further complicated by the question of adding or subtracting the degrees of turn to roll out. Lag and lead can be minimized by making very shallow banks. If you limit banks to half standard rate or less, the compass seems to be more truthful. After attempting to use the compass to turn to headings, pilots become much more enthusiastic about perfecting timed turn technique. For most of us, timed turns work out much better than compass turns. Another trick to use, if a level turn is through east or west, is to time the turn from those headings. The compass is believable on those headings, giving you a reliable intermediate point from which to measure time. Beyond your practical exam, you may have other tools in the cockpit available for heading control after the loss of your heading indicator. In the event of an actual failure, the track indication on your GPS can provide an emergency backup. Even the indications of a handheld GPS may be useful in an emergency. Depending on the equipment, there may be a slight delay in the indication, but it will be consistent for the unit. The GPS track indication can be easier to interpret and to use than the magnetic compass. If you decide to use this indication during an emergency, inform ATC. This will allow the controller to take out the wind correction normally added to heading assignments. Hopefully, you'll never be forced to fly partial panel. Pump and instrument failures do occur, so it's best to be prepared. Remember, the principle of insurance is protection against events that rarely happen, but could be catastrophic when they do. The cheapest insurance you can have is to maintain your proficiency on partial panel. It's more work, less fun, and can be downright embarrassing. But it'll be worth every moment you spend when and if any instruments go belly up. Now let's join Dick Collins, who has some thoughts on partial panel flying as it was done back in the good old days.
Oh no, is this ancient pelican going to tell us all about the good old days of partial panel flying? No war stories really, but a little background on it might help you out.
For quite a while, this was the primary way that it was done, with no direct pitch and bank information as we get from the attitude indicator, and no stabilized heading information as we get from the heading indicator. For bank control, we basically flew with turn indication and the ball to tell us whether or not we were in coordinated flight. The only turn instrument in use was the turn in bank because the turn coordinator had not yet been invented. The magnetic compass told of the direction of flight. The airspeed, altimeter, and vertical speed were the pitch control indications. The pitch part was easy enough because airplanes are stable in pitch and will seek the speed for which they're trimmed. I'm sure there were as many different techniques as pilots, but I used to fly the vertical speed for pitch when in level flight. It does have a lag, but we learned the lag and could even use the vertical speed to maintain altitude in steep turns. The altimeter and airspeed were backups, with the airspeed of more importance in climbs and descents. The turn needle is a straightforward instrument and is fairly easy to fly, easier than a turn coordinator, but that's just my opinion. Both should be thought of as offering information on rate of turn or lack thereof. The key to flying with these basic instruments is visualization. You have to think in terms of the attitude of the airplane to control it and make it go in all the right directions. Needle in the center, ball in the center equals wings level. Check the compass for the correct heading. Check the vertical speed right on 0. Check the altitude is correct. Check the airspeed is okay. Drone along. On approaches, it got more interesting back in the good old days. Precision and timing turns was critical to the proceedings. No vectors to final in those days, no radar, so virtually all approaches involved the full procedure. That meant a minimum of 2 45-degree turns and a 180-degree turn. Foul one turn up badly and the whole approach was trashed. Two things did help us then and can help you now if you're ever faced with an actual partial panel condition. One is the fact that there were simply less instruments to look at. The scan was thus simplified. Because of the nature of it, we paid the most attention to bank control and accurate turns. Where we might, with a full panel, camp on the attitude indicator and check everything else for progress, we then camped on the turn and bank and checked everything else for progress. The other thing that helped was the fact that we navigated with our ears when using the old 4-course low-frequency ranges. The signals we heard from the station told us whether or not we were flying on one of those 4 courses. There were less flight instruments and no navigational instruments to look at. You can do the same thing today by getting vectors and a no-gyro approach, thus taking the primary navigational chore out of the cockpit. I do want to stress one thing. Even though partial panel flying was a normal procedure in the dark ages, it should now be considered an emergency procedure. If the power source to your instruments, vacuum on most airplanes, fails, take decisive action. Cover the instruments that are inoperative to keep them from distracting you with odd indications. Tell the controller of the condition and request vectors to the nearest airport where they can give you a no-gyro approach. Alternately, request vectors to VFR conditions.
All the way, remember the most important thing. If you keep bank under control, you likely keep the whole airplane under control.
Let's take a look at why air-driven attitude and heading instruments could fail by examining the vacuum and pressure systems. The air-driven gyros, which stabilize the attitude and heading indicators, are usually called the vacuum instruments. This is somewhat of a misnomer because they are driven due to a differential between ambient pressure and the pressure in the case of the instrument. In some installations, a partial vacuum is created inside the case of the instrument, which allows air to rush into the case through ports or nozzles which aim the incoming air onto the vanes of the gyro rotor. The rotor is spun just like the water wheel or a turbine. In other installations, air under pressure is pumped through the nozzles into the case with the same result, that is, spinning the rotor. The spinning rotor brings about rigidity in space, the gyroscopic principle on which the attitude and heading indicators function. Years ago, Venturis were used to create the pressure differential which spins the gyro rotor. The Venturi is the grandfather of Bernoulli's theorem of lift. It's simply a pipe which in cross-section looks like the opposing upper surfaces of airfoils. As air encounters the reduced area of the Venturi, there is a velocity increase with a corresponding decrease in pressure. The Venturi was mounted on the outside of the airplane, usually under the belly or on the side, and connected to the instrument cases. The decreased pressure literally sucked air out of the instrument cases, allowing incoming air to rush through the nozzles, spinning the rotor. Venturis were designed for maximum efficiency at a specific airspeed. Any variation from this speed or air density affected the pressure at the venturi throat and the vacuum driving the gyro rotors. Another major disadvantage was that since there was no vacuum before takeoff, there was no way to check or set the indicators. Add to this the susceptibility for the venturi to pick up ice and clog, and you can see why pilots preferred another source of differential pressure to drive the rotors. The answer was to put an engine-driven pump under the cowling,